Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Mark Sedra on Afghanistan after Canada's departure. Hello and welcome back to this season's series of episodes of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, and every week I will speak with a notable expert on some aspect of international public policy or global governance here from the studios of the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And I'm pleased to welcome back to the studio Mark Sedra, a CIGI Senior Fellow and Research Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Mark, you were our early guest in our initial season series last year, speaking about Afghanistan, and so we've had almost a full year now in order to reflect on what's happened since you last talked to us. And of course, the big change is that Canada's now officially gone, not entirely gone. Of course, we maintain a smaller group of people in Afghanistan helping to train NATO soldiers. But let me start with the obvious question. How much have things changed in that last year, and are things better, worse, or about the same?
Well, thanks, David. And unfortunately, they're a lot worse. We have seen levels of violence continue to worsen. We've seen with each passing month, we see more and more casualties, both among the Afghan security forces, civilians, as well as the NATO soldiers. We now have reached there's about 14,000 Afghan civilians have died since 2001, and this number, again, keeps increasing. We've seen a huge rift emerge between the Afghan government and the Western powers. Many Western officials, particularly in Washington, will now say that Karzai cannot be trusted. President Karzai cannot be trusted. We've seen levels of corruption and mismanagement within the Afghan administration increase, public attitudes towards the state plummet within Afghanistan. But as I said, also the security situation is probably most alarming. The Taliban continue to gain in strength, it would appear, as opposed to really be contained by the NATO's insurgency surge.
Now, we and other NATO countries originally got into Afghanistan not specifically to fight the Taliban, but to root out al-Qaeda. What's the relative balance of problems here now? Is al-Qaeda a completely irrelevant factor in Afghanistan now, and it's just the question of the Taliban trying to reassert its authority? Or is al-Qaeda still a problem to be dealt with in Afghanistan?
Well, al-Qaeda, some would say that it has no presence in Afghanistan whatsoever now, and that's not true. I mean, al-Qaeda has a presence. We still do see that al-Qaeda is providing some support to the Taliban. It certainly doesn't have the roots and infrastructure it did prior to 9/11, where Afghanistan was its principal base of operations for the entire world. So certainly they have been seriously disrupted and largely dislodged from Afghanistan, but they still have influence. A lot of al-Qaeda operatives and infrastructure migrated to Pakistan and now is in the Pakistani tribal areas, where we've seen the CIA use drones to try and attack those operatives there, and the Pakistani government also trying to dismantle the infrastructure there. So Afghanistan is not completely free of al-Qaeda influence, but most of it is gone.
In the grand scheme of things, it looks like al-Qaeda's in trouble globally, relatively few places left where it's actually got any operational capacity. Not so the Taliban, right? I mean, the Taliban continues to be the problem in Afghanistan, and also a problem in Pakistan. Have we actually made things worse by trying to fix the problem in Afghanistan in the first place?
I mean, you could make that argument. I mean, certainly you've seen now many people talk about the Talibanization of Pakistan, where you've seen another group allied to the Afghan Taliban, which is the Pakistani Taliban, emerge and grow in strength. I mean, they're the group that assassinated Benazir Bhutto. They're the group that now also threatens the stability of the Pakistani state in certain parts of the country. So there's certainly some of the impacts of the war in Afghanistan have reverberated throughout the region. The Taliban, they are certainly not a monolithic group. They, there are many different elements within the Taliban movement. You have the Haqqani network. You have even Hizb Islami, which is a related group, not the Taliban itself, but allied to the Taliban. So you have a number of different groups there that are operating. So that, I think, has been a major impediment to try and make what I think is one of the most important moves here, which is to reach out to make some sort of peace deal with the Taliban. I think that's, at this stage, is one of the only hopes to try and find some sort of stability in Afghanistan going forward.
It does appear that there is an emerging consensus on that, that at the end game, whatever it is in Afghanistan is going to have to include the Taliban. It's almost mind-boggling to me that we've reached that point.
Yeah.
When for so long the purpose was to create a democratic, representative, well-functioning, ultimately liberal Afghan state. We've basically given up on that, haven't we?
Well, you know, I think so, to a certain degree. I mean, you certainly would be hard-pressed to find somebody in Ottawa, Washington, or London and so on to admit to that. But, you know, often you'll see policymakers now talk about Afghan good enough, as opposed to, so they're lowering their expectations, as opposed to trying to achieve their sort of maximalist objectives, which was a democratic Afghanistan. I mean, in my view, you know, in addition to finding some sort of peace agreement with the Taliban, there are two other preconditions to finding some sort of stability in the country and avoiding a relapse of civil war, which is a very real possibility right now. One of them is that there would have to be some sort of regional framework that's established. You cannot find peace in Afghanistan unless you bring the Pakistanis on board, unless you bring the Iranians on board, the Indians and others. We just saw in the last few days the Afghans conclude a strategic arrangement with the Indians, a strategic agreement with the Indians, in which the Indians would provide support to the Afghan security forces. This is really, you know, spit in the face of Pakistan in many ways. The Afghans are frustrated with the Pakistanis. The Indians, of course, are frustrated with the Pakistanis and are in an ongoing conflict with the Pakistanis. But this isn't helpful to find some sort of, again, a peace in Afghanistan. So you need that some sort of regional framework that not only will prevent interference, but also have sort of encourage more cooperative behavior in Afghanistan that might have economic benefits and might have trade benefits and so on. The last thing is, the reality is that Afghanistan will not be able to stand on its own feet for 10, 20, maybe even a generation. It's going to need budgetary support for years to come, almost at current levels. Now, what worries me is that with the financial crisis in the world today, with different states tightening their belts, introducing austerity measures, even in the United States the last few days, talking about cutting foreign aid in the budget. I just don't see that aid being there. But the reality is the international community has created an Afghan state that the Afghans can't afford.
Right.
And it's going to collapse if that pipeline of aid shuts off.
I'd like to follow that up with you in a minute when we come back. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, or on YouTube. Welcome back. Mark, let's pick up where we left off. Why would any of the neighbors want to buy into this mess? Why would any regional actor want to commit resources, troops, expertise, anything that might actually expose them to a contagion of Taliban insurgency or Al-Qaeda terrorism or anything like that? What's the incentive for the neighbors to help out here?
Bottom line is a stable Afghanistan that doesn't pose a threat to its neighbors, and that's a threat either the spillover of militancy, the black market trade in weapons or drugs, to contain that and have a stable neighbor with stable and secure borders is in the interests of all of Afghanistan's neighbors. I mean, if you look on the drug issue, Iran has one of the highest per capita addiction rates or usage rates of heroin and opium in the world. Afghan opiates that flow across the border has huge negative social impacts in Iran. They would like to see the drug trade stopped. You know, in Pakistan, the Talibanization of parts of the tribal areas of Pakistan and a result of what's happened in Afghanistan. You see militancy from that originated in Afghanistan affecting the whole region, India, and even the international community. I mean, the bombings in Madrid, Bali, New York, the terrorists that that carry these out, they cut their teeth in the training bases of Afghanistan. So, so it's in their direct interest, and one of the reasons they are interfering in Afghanistan is to try and is to try and prevent Afghanistan from affecting them negatively, and to try and blunt the negative impacts of Afghanistan, to use it to their own strategic advantage. If we could come to some sort of regional agreement on non-interference in Afghanistan that all of the states agree to and commit to, and that there are monitoring mechanisms to ensure that they are actually abiding by that agreement, I think it would have an immensely positive effect.
Can you have a stable Afghanistan where the Taliban are part of the arrangement?
I think you can. I mean, I think, it's a mistake to, again, paint the Taliban, with one brush. I mean, there are moderate elements of the Taliban. There are pragmatic elements of the Taliban movement that you can work with. I mean, I think clearly the Afghan government, the international community are going to have red lines in any negotiation, and that's a tough thing. But some of the fundamental freedoms that are enshrined in the Afghan constitution, clearly they're going to be unwilling to allow them to fall by the wayside. But I think it is possible. Now the problem today is, and I mean, I ask this question of anybody: if you are in a war, you feel you're winning, and the enemy has given you their departure date,
right,
with which NATO is in 2014,
right,
would you be willing to make any tough concessions?
Right.
The answer is really no. And the Taliban, feel they're winning, and they're not really in a mood to compromise at this stage, understandably. So so that worries me in terms of the future of any negotiated settlement.
Mm-hmm. And who is actually supporting the Taliban? Mm-hmm. Where are they getting their resources? Where are they getting their real base of support?
The Taliban gets some of their resources from the drug trade. They run essentially a protection racket for some traffickers. They also tax farmers in areas that are under their control who are growing opium. They protect those farmers as well. They also receive some money from benefactors abroad, primarily in the Gulf states. That's actually quite a large source of income for the Taliban. And also we know that there are some, illicit money that's flowing to the Taliban from Al-Qaeda and other associated militant groups and terrorist groups. So there's, some different funding sources there. But I mean, even the operations that the Taliban are running are not particularly expensive. In recent days, of course, they've shifted tactics. They're not really confronting NATO on the battlefield, the front lines of the battlefield as much, but they're, resorting classic counterinsurgency tactics, assassinations, high-level assassinations. They've killed Karzai's brother, they've killed Rabbani, the former president, and the head of the High Peace Council, the mayor of Kandahar, a former governor Uruzgan, as well as at the local level, mullahs, police chiefs on an everyday basis. So a campaign of assassination, but also high-level attacks like the 20-hour gun battle at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, one of the most heavily fortified areas of the entire region. And they were able to bring it to a standstill and paralyze it. Or the attack on the landmark Intercontinental Hotel. These are meant to shock Afghans, shock the world, and show that the Taliban has the ability to attack anywhere and at any time. In many ways, I see this as also setting up the stage for the next phase of the civil war once NATO leaves, that killing a former high-ranking official in the northern, a current high-ranking official in the Northern Alliance, Rabbani, also an inspirational figure in that movement, is really a shot across the bow of the Northern Alliance, who everyone knows, it's an open secret that they're rearming in the event that the war could resume.
You say in the event.
Yeah.
And the way you describe it sounds almost inevitable to me.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, I hate to say this after being committed to working on this country and doing research in this country for 10 years, but I see it's very difficult now to see a way to avoid another round of conflict. The fact is that there is really very little appetite in the West, in Western capitals, including Canada, but also in the United States, to stay in Afghanistan much longer than 2014. Once those countries are out and have the majority of their assets out of the country, their troops, I don't see that the funding will last long. So it reminds me a lot of when the Soviets left Afghanistan and left the communist government in power. And that government under Najibullah lasted for 2 or 3 years, but then it was overrun by the Mujahideen groups. So unfortunately, I see that as a distinct possibility going forward, that again, we're going to see a resumption of conflict, and that's going to have disastrous consequences, of course, for the Afghan people, but also the region.
Right. Now, even in the heyday of the Taliban, pre-9/11, They never really controlled the whole country.
Yeah.
They basically didn't have much of a presence in the far north regions, did they?
Absolutely.
So that would be the most likely scenario in your view, that you have it a de facto partition of Afghanistan again?
Yeah, I think you're right on. I think one of the differences now is, and the impacts or the legacies of the last 10 years is, the Northern Alliance were about to be wiped out when 9/11 happened. The Taliban controlled 95% of the country. What the last 10 years has done is allowed the Northern Alliance to rebuild again, to where there's rough parity again. So if the international community were to leave Afghanistan, a civil war would emerge. There would be roughly a stalemate where the Taliban and some associated groups like Hizb-ut-Islami would control a good part of the south and east of the country, and the Northern Alliance parts of the west and north. So you would have effectively a split of the country with.
Who would control Kabul?
Well, yeah, that's a big question, and probably considering it is really a Northern Alliance controlled city right now, probably the Northern Alliance would retain control of that. But how it plays out is impossible to say exactly. Right. But it's either way, there's going to be low intensity violence still, even if you have some sort of stalemate between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. I mean, the best case scenario right now that I can see is you have a central state government that's able to maintain rough control over the center of the country, a few urban centers, but without much ability to project into the countryside, which will be controlled by the various factions.
We don't have a crystal ball, but we've got a murky frosted glass ball.
Absolutely.
We'll be back again in a moment with Mark Sedra to talk about Afghanistan after Canada's departure. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Mark, let's look at Canada's role.
Yeah.
We went into Afghanistan with one goal in mind. It morphed into another goal.
Yep.
And we left with, I'm not quite sure how you would want to characterize the goal as we were leaving. Walk us through, if you will, Canada's contribution to the effort in Afghanistan and put it in a larger context. Was it well-meaning but fruitless? Was it partly successful? Was it unsuccessful at the end of the day? How would you characterize it?
Well, I mean, we have been part of a multilateral enterprise here. It's hard to say, how did Canada's aid and assistance impact Afghanistan more than others? I mean, certainly I would say it is a case to use an old cliche that's often associated to Canada. We did punch above our weight in Afghanistan. I mean, we committed, of course, a large number of soldiers. We suffered per capita losses that were among the highest among all the NATO member states. We committed a lot of aid. This was our largest bilateral aid commitment for some time, and we were among, again, per capita, one of the largest aid contributors to Afghanistan. Canada was at every major decision-making table in Afghanistan. I mean, that's something to be proud of, and maybe with the exception of Haiti, you can't really see too many other contexts where Canada played such an important role politically in this type of war to peace transition. So I think in that sense, it's something that Canadians can look at and say, well, hey, we made a major contribution here. Of course, though, I think the mission is going to be judged by its ultimate impact. And as we've been talking about already today, I think that Canadian assistance, NATO assistance was well-meaning, but I think in the end, it will probably look like it's going to be not enough to actually prevent the recurrence of warfare and a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. So I think it's going to cause Canadians and Americans and others in the NATO alliance to really ask some tough questions. What really did we do there? And we asked many of our young men and women to make the ultimate sacrifice for this conflict, and did we really make any headway? And I think that's an open question. And I mean, because a lot of mistakes were made. I mean, we did a lot of good things too. If you look at the development indicators, we built a lot of schools, we built dams, we made some major development achievements. But what is development? What are schools and clinics when you don't have peace?
Right.
And they don't mean very much over the long term if you don't have some sort of base level security.
Right. Now that was the noble part of the mission, was building peace.
Yeah.
And you could say that it's been hard and possibly unsuccessful because peace building in general is hard and unsuccessful, or it could be specifically because of reasons having to do with Afghanistan. Which way would you lean on that? Was this just a bad place to try to do peace building, or is that in general
I think it's a little bit of both, but I would start by saying that it's hard to imagine a more difficult case to build peace and to build a state than Afghanistan. I mean, you had, you know, highly fragmented society, ethnically, tribally, one of the poorest countries in the entire world, one of the lowest countries on the Human Development Index. You know, a country that just emerged from 3 decades of civil war where, you know, probably more than 50% of the population, probably far more, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, you have broken minds in this society and huge divisions to try and heal. And really, you know, you've had historically a state, you've had a limited state in Kabul at various times, but these are institutions were still really fractured and in their infancy. So, so there wasn't really a whole lot to build upon early on, and many obstacles to any sort of change. So I think that you know, in that sense, it was always you know, hugely tall order to achieve any level of success. And I think you know, the international community would have been better off tempering some of their expectations in Afghanistan. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems here is timelines. I mean, the reality is to reconstruct a society like Afghanistan, it takes more than a decade. It takes many decades, and you have to be willing to take some serious losses, and I just don't think there's the appetite in the international community to do that right now. I mean, on the larger question of peace building and state building, I mean, there aren't, frankly, I mean, you know this as well as I do, that there aren't many clear success stories to draw upon. I mean, with the exception of places like Germany and Japan and so on, which of course were highly advanced societies even before World War II. So
and they acknowledged their defeat.
Yeah,
absolutely. At the end of the day, willing to be occupied.
Precisely. I mean, even the Bonn Agreement was not a classical peace agreement. It was a victor's peace where one side was being bombed to submission and never really ended the conflict. So, so you know, I think that it was always going to be tough. I think we underestimated the challenges. There was certainly an underestimate of the costs to reconstruct Afghanistan. That's widely known. And I think a lot of mistakes were early made. I mean, even made early on, I should say. I mean, even Lakhdar Brahimi, the first UN envoy to Afghanistan, calls the Bonn Agreement now original sin because of the mistakes made. So I think that says it all.
There was a time 5 or 6 years ago now when we used to lean very heavily on promoting women's rights as one of our reasons for being active in Afghanistan. That seemed to fall by the wayside not too long afterward, in part because the Karzai government didn't seem to have a whole lot of appetite for standing up for that principle. You know, there certainly was a lot of pushback within the Afghan administration. We often talk about the Taliban as being the fundamentalists, but the Northern Alliance, many of those figures are also, you know, very conservative Islamists. So I think that there was a lot of pushback towards women's rights. On the other hand, tremendous progress. I mean, we've seen now, you know, 7 million children return to school, about half of which were girls. We've seen now the Afghan parliament, there are more female parliamentarians in Afghanistan than in Canada. I mean, part of that is because there are quotas, but many women were elected beyond the quotas as well. So, so you have women, you know, entering professions again in medicine and teaching and so on, who are barred from doing that under the Taliban regime. You know, we have seen in many, and one of the big success stories of Afghanistan is actually, in some ways, the flourishing of civil society. You've seen businesses start to emerge and grow. I mean, if you were in Kabul in 2001 and were there today, the construction boom that has happened has been quite amazing, the entrepreneurship we've seen. But also in the media, in the arts, we've seen some significant achievements there, and I think that's something to be proud of. But again, all of that is fragile because of really the failures to move the peace process forward. So we've seen some tremendous gains and some setbacks as well in some of these areas, but in the end, what's going to determine the outcome here is going to be whether you can find some sort of peace. And right now, I'm not convinced that we can find that. Well, we'll come back one more time to chat with Mark Sedra about Afghanistan after Canada's departure. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Mark, you've spent a lot of time working in Afghanistan, specifically on security sector reform. So maybe now I can ask you to reflect on what you've learned about that topic in general, and also with respect to Afghanistan. Has your view of that problem changed in the course of your research? And if so, how has it changed? And what would you say if a policymaker invited you to sit down with him or her and tell him or her exactly what you think the keys are to security sector reform?
Well, I mean, security sector reform itself has essentially was the exit strategy of the international community in Afghanistan. And because it was, you know, as George W. Bush used to say about Iraq, when they can stand up, meaning the Iraqi security forces, we can stand down and our troops can leave. And the same formula applied to Afghanistan and applies to many other transition states. And so a lot was invested. I mean, we're talking about the United States alone has spent something like $41 billion on building up the Afghan national security forces. You know, the problem is there was a lot of wrong-headed strategies towards that. First of all, the focus was always on a heavily militarized approach. I mean, even in reference to the police. The police are not classical police as we would understand them to be in Waterloo or in Washington, D.C. or New York. They're essentially militarized paramilitary police who have not been able to develop any sort of rapport with the Afghan population. They aren't seen as an institution that serves and protects the people. The institutions within the security sector are also highly corrupt. They've never really been able to get a handle on that, nor have they approached it effectively.
Are they corrupt in the sense of they misappropriate public resources, or are they rapacious?
Both. You see very much a predatory approach towards the population, abusive and predatory. But also we've seen both petty corruption at the local level in terms of extracting money at checkpoints, at illegal checkpoints, or right up to embezzlement of large amounts of funds in the Ministry of Interior and in other ministries. One of the other areas, I mean, the whole concept of security sector reform is supposed to be holistic in that you understand that to have an effective police, you have to have a judiciary that is also stands strongly on 2 feet and is stable. And there was very little investment in building up the judiciary in Afghanistan. It was not even close to the amount that you would require. Moreover, there was not really a lot of focus on building up the governance structures that you need. I mean, that's one of the great innovations of the security sector reform concept, as opposed to more traditional Cold War era sort of realpolitik security assistance, is that it looks at also how the security forces, the judiciary are governed, that ensuring that there's democratic civilian control, that there's accountability, transparency, and so on. And again, this was completely overlooked. The primary focus of the United States, who's been the primary driver of the Afghan National Security Force development process, and NATO, has been to just get boots on the ground, regardless, and that has largely has not been very effective. I mean, we've seen now the Afghan security forces, still very few of them are capable of operating independently without NATO support. When they have been in operations, sometimes they've performed well, but in most cases inadequately for what we would expect of them if NATO forces were to leave. So I think
not because they're ill-equipped, but because they're ill-trained?
No, yeah, ill-trained, and it takes time to mentor these forces and allow them to really sort of consolidate their role within the state and within society. I mean, there hasn't been enough time for them to consolidate their skill set and so on. But yeah, I mean, part of a lot of it is training. I mean, and providing the right skills for the job.
Is there a better way to do it?
Yeah.
Like, do you start at the community level and you start with block by block policing by people who are members of the community and sort of gradually scale up?
Yeah, there has to be. I mean, I understand the urge for quantity to get a lot of boots on the ground quickly, but the reality is that there has to be really an emphasis on quality over quantity.
And some kind of trust relationship with the people.
Exactly, trust relationship. And you have to ensure that different security forces have different roles, so that the military focus is more on sort of the counterinsurgency, the more classic military roles, and that you have a police that can cater to the local community. Because even in a counterinsurgency, effective counterinsurgency tactics rely on community trust, that community are willing to feed intelligence and also to not provide support for the enemy. So, and the reality is right now that many of these forces are incapable of interacting effectively with communities, and you'd be hard pressed to find any Afghan who trusts the police. Right. I mean, that's illusory. I mean, one of the bigger problems also with the security forces that are being created, I mean, this is admitted everywhere, is that there is no way that the Afghans could sustain the security system that is being constructed for them, it is far beyond their capability financially to pay for it, even under the most optimistic projections for decades to come.
So if NATO pulls back, who steps up?
Yeah. It would have to be NATO, and it would have to be the United States. The United States essentially is creating a force that they will have to subsidize for decades. And we know, we've seen in history, in Afghan history, on several occasions that of states, rentier states, that were created with external subsidies. And when those subsidies were pulled back, the state has collapsed. It's happened more than once. So
we've seen that recently in the Arab Spring.
Absolutely.
With, in some cases, potentially positive developments.
Yeah, I mean I think obviously these are very different cases in the Arab world. You have, these are authoritarian states, not many with active conflicts ongoing. But the reality is also in some cases of Libya, wealthy societies that could sustain those structures. In the Afghan case, it very much appears that we're creating the conditions in which the state will collapse, as opposed to focusing on what the Afghans can afford within their means. This is sustain on their own. I mean, this is basic development theory and practice. I mean, that in basic development doctrine, that you create structures and systems that are sustainable. And right now, that's not what we've done.
Well, Mark, thanks again so much for coming in and sharing your expertise. I don't know of anybody who's got as rich or as articulate an account of what's happened in Afghanistan, so we're grateful to you for spending time with us. And to our audience, please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.